The deep state has a crazy new curriculum teaching little children that America has racism and slavery embedded in its DNA. If this is allowed to continue, America as a nation will be destroyed. For more great content like you get from these Behind the Deep State shows, make sure to get over to thenewamerican.com. YouTube, Facebook, the big tech companies absolutely despise us. We might not even be here too much longer. So head over to thenewamerican.com, sign up for the daily headlines, and more importantly, get a subscription to the New American magazine. So the New York Times has been absolutely critical in promoting tyranny around the world. In the late 1950s, a propagandist for the New York Times named Herbert Matthews lied to the American people and claimed that Fidel Castro was an anti-communist freedom fighter. He was the George Washington of Cuba. Now, sensible people knew better. Robert Welch, the founder of the John Birch Society, said, no, this guy's a communist. Earl Smith, the U.S. ambassador to Havana, said, wait a minute, this guy's a communist. What are you guys doing? But nope, New York Times, Herbert Matthews said, oh no, this guy is a freedom fighter. And of course, that led to the enslavement of Cuba under communist despotism. Before that, a communist propagandist for the New York Times by the name of Walter Duranty lied to the American people in the 1930s, basically parroted Stalin's propaganda to the American people, even denied that there was a famine and a genocide going on in the Ukraine. An estimated 10 million people died in that genocide. Absolute atrocity, barbaric savagery on an unimaginable scale, and the New York Times was dutifully telling the American people that, oh, there's nothing going on there, but even if there was, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet. So with that as a backdrop, and that's just a tiny sample of the New York Times dishonesty that has led to mass murder and communist slavery, with that as a backdrop, I want to introduce to you the 1619 Project. Now, the New York Times is a megaphone for deep state propaganda in the United States. Now, this 1619 Project, they say, is an effort to reframe American history through the lens of slavery and oppression. What it really is a lie straight from the pit of hell designed to destroy the United States as a nation, as an idea, as a people, as a culture, as a civilization, and as a bastion of liberty for the world. Fortunately, the lies, these monstrous lies that are being peddled, were caught early. Just in the last few days, if you're watching this when this just came out, President Donald Trump has been speaking out about this abomination. And I want to show you just a little clip from that.
The left has warped, distorted, and defiled the American story with deceptions, falsehoods, and lies. There is no better example than the New York Times totally discredited 1619 Project. This project rewrites American history to teach our children that we were founded on the principle of oppression, not freedom. Nothing could be further from the truth.
All right, so you heard it from the President of the United States. Now let's dig into this abomination called the 1619 Project. Basically, the core claim is that anti-Black racism and slavery and systematic oppression and evil are embedded in, and I quote, the very DNA of America. Now, if this evil is embedded in the DNA of America, there's nothing we could do to get rid of it. It's part of who we are, right? There's no political transformation. There's no revolution. There's no policy changes. There's nothing we could do to get this evil DNA out of our nation. And so what is the logical conclusion? Well, the nation is irredeemable. It must be destroyed. It must be completely and totally crushed and replaced with something new. That is, of course, the ultimate objective of this latest deep state propaganda campaign. And it's not just propaganda for adults. It is also a curriculum to brainwash students. And we're going to talk about that. Fortunately, the narrative is based on lies that are so obviously fraudulent that hopefully this poison, this ideological poison, can be neutralized with a dose of truth. But the threat remains, right? There are already thousands. One of the estimates I saw said 4,500 high schools across America are now using this 1619 Project to teach history to these impressionable young people. This propaganda is also making its way down into junior high schools and even into elementary schools. Again, it's already been debunked, even by the New York Times' own fact checkers, and we'll get to that. But millions of captive children who don't know any better, who don't have any frame of reference, who've been dumbed down already, been indoctrinated, do not have any way of resisting this propaganda. So that's the real danger. And if we let this rot fester, if we let it continue to be pumped into the minds of our children, you can kiss your country goodbye, folks. You can kiss your liberties goodbye. Now, on the right side, people are upset about this, and more broadly, people are saying, wait a minute, if you're pumping that into the schools, we need to see what else is going on in the schools. So that's really good. Trump is threatening to withhold federal funding from these brainwash camps. Of course, there should be no federal funding for government schools in the first place. But, as long as we're going to have that mechanism, it's good that Donald Trump is talking about it. And it is sparking a national conversation. You have a lot of people across America who are looking at this and saying, oh, my goodness, really? How is it possible that this got into our schools? So that's a positive thing. But I want to get into this 1619 Project narrative. Now, it was mostly invented by this fake journalist, Nikole Hannah-Jones, who actually got a Pulitzer Prize for these lies. We'll come back to that. And she is really just parroting a kook historian from the University of Houston and his lies. But what it does is it completely flips American history upside down.
What if I told you that America is a country born of both an idea and a lie?
Now, in the real world, America and the founding fathers distilled these biblical principles, right? The idea that all men are created equal, the idea that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So they took these principles from the Bible, they turned it into a governing political system, right? God said, thou shalt not murder. And so they said, hey, you have an inalienable right to life that God granted to you. God said, thou shalt not steal. So they said, hey, you have an inalienable right to property that nobody is allowed to take from you. Liberty, right? All these inalienable rights, as Sam Adams, the father of the American Revolution, explained in the early letters that were circulating through the committees of correspondence, these principles came from the New Testament of the Bible. And these biblical principles, enshrined into a system of government, led to the creation of the freest, most prosperous, most successful nation in all of human history. It also led to the abolishing of slavery, first here, later around the world. Because, of course, if all men are created equal, it is inconceivable that some men could be enslaved. If all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, then certainly no man has the right to take those rights away from anybody. If God gave you the rights, a human can't take them away. And so in less than a century, in fact, significantly less than a century, the evil of slavery was eradicated in this country. There was a civil war to accomplish it. Yes, Democrats were really attached to their slaves. And, of course, it was only a tiny fraction of the population that had slaves, but the Democrats were very attached to their slaves. And so it took a civil war. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died to liberate the slaves, but it was based on these principles that America was founded on, right? Now, if you look at this 1619 Project, everything about America is defined and must be viewed through the lens of slavery and this temporary tolerance that Americans had for an institution that had literally been with humanity from the dawn of humanity, right? It's been ubiquitous in every human society going back to the very beginning. And because we tolerated that for a short while, because our forefathers did, then everything about America is evil, our DNA is evil, and it must be smashed. Now, the date, the 1619 Project, it was released on the 400th anniversary of the arrival in 1619 of a group of 20 indentured servants from Africa. This was a group of people who had been kidnapped by African warlords from the Imbangala people in what is modern-day Angola. Now, once they got to Virginia, they were not actually slaves. They were actually indentured servants, as even the Guardian fake newspaper admitted. And they joined European indentured servants who had been brought over by the Virginia Company. Now, the New York Times and their 1619 Project does not even mention any of these facts. They just call the Africans slaves, which is not true. They also make no reference to the fact that one of America's first military engagements after it became a new nation was to battle African slave catchers, right? The Barbary states of northern Africa that were kidnapping Europeans and Americans from the high seas and using them as slaves in Africa. Nor does the Times mention a very, very interesting fellow by the name of Antonio Johnson, who later become known as Anthony Johnson. He was one of the first Africans to arrive in Virginia. He arrived as an indentured servant. He completed his time of servitude, became a free man, and became a very wealthy and prosperous man. He actually owned the rights to multiple indentured servants, both European descendants and Africans, and he became, interestingly enough, the first legal slave owner in the Virginia colony. The first ever recorded slave owner where the court ruled that he was allowed to keep his servant in bondage for life over a dispute that had emerged. Now, not a word of that appears in the New York Times, which should tell you quite a bit about how honest they are. And what they said about this project is that it's supposed to reframe the country's history by placing the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans at the very center of the narrative, right? Everything, literally everything, even traffic in Atlanta, Georgia, it was supposedly caused by slavery, and so everything must be seen in the light of slavery. Now, they didn't actually reframe anything. What they did was they invented fake history. They just literally made stuff up completely out of thin air, and it was so bad that even the New York Times' own historian said, "Hey, wait a minute, this is fake news, guys. Sorry, you cannot actually publish this."
Scope of this thing, especially since it's going to become the basis for high school education and has the authority of the New York Times behind it, and yet could be so wrong in so many ways.
Well, they ignored their own historian. They ignored all the historians who warned them about this. Instead, they relied on this goofball from the University of Houston called Gerald Horne. He claims to be a historian. He also happens to be a supporter of Fidel Castro, the mass-murdering butcher who the New York Times helped to enslave Cuba, and he was a big-time supporter of the genocidal Marxist mass-murdering tyrant named Robert Mugabe, who enslaved Zimbabwe with help from Jimmy Carter and the United Nations and the Soviet Union, and then promptly proceeded to try to exterminate the Ndebele people in Matabele land. So this guy literally murdered more African people than all of the white Americans living today, and yet this Mr. Horne loves him. Okay, interesting. Well, this is where these stupid ideas came from this 1619 project, and right off the bat, I mean, just to give you a sense of how bad this is from a factual perspective, even the headline contains multiple factual errors. It starts off with, and this is a direct quote from the headline, "Our democracy's founding ideals were false when they were written." So let's break that down. First of all, America is not a democracy. If this Hannah-Jones had actually bothered to do even the most basic research on America, she would have known that America was not a democracy. It was never supposed to be a democracy. In fact, she could have read Federalist Number 10 by the guy who literally wrote our Constitution, James Madison, who incidentally was an ardent opponent of slavery. And he explained very clearly that democracy is a terrible form of government. Your rights are not going to be safe. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence, and they soon die these violent deaths, right? They're generally as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths. This was written by the guy who wrote the Constitution. She could have also read the Constitution, where it says in Article 4, Section 4, that every state in the Union is guaranteed a democracy. No, just kidding. It's guaranteed a Republican form of government. It's not about the political parties, right? Democracy is mob rule. It's two wolves and a sheep voting on what's going to be for dinner. A republic is a system where the rule of law, in our case, law that comes from God, right? Thou shalt not murder. You have a right to life. Thou shalt not steal. You have a right to property, et cetera, is the foundation. And the law is superior to the will of the mob, is superior to the president, is superior to the Congress, and so on. So that's the difference right there. But Hannah-Jones was not interested in real history. So right in the first sentence of the headline, we have a factual error. Then there's another one, right? This idea that the founding ideals were false. What is that supposed to mean? Is it not true that all men are created equal? Is it not true that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights? Are you some kind of racist who believes that some people have rights and other people don't? What is that supposed to mean? It's obviously, I mean, the founders said it was a self-evident truth that we're all created equal, that we're all endowed with inalienable rights. How could she say that's false? I don't know. Then the next sentence, right? The next sentence in the headline, Black Americans have fought to make them true, implying, and she actually says that later explicitly, that only Black Americans, they had to struggle against all evil white people. All white people are guilty for this sin of slavery. Frankly, this whole idea of collective guilt, collective punishment is repugnant. In fact, when the Nazis looked at this, when the Nazis were put on trial, collective punishment, collective guilt were considered to be war crimes. No mention of any of that. Also, no mention of any of the hundreds of thousands of Americans of European descent who fought to end slavery in America, right? Who died in the Civil War. Instead, all quote-unquote white Americans are guilty of this sin, while all Black Americans have been struggling for freedom against these evil white Americans. Now, I'll stop here for another caveat. As a Christian, I reject even the premise of this, right? The whole idea that we should divide people up into races is repugnant to a Christian. The Bible says everybody comes from one blood. The Bible says we all come from Adam and Eve. And so I have more in common with a Black Christian than I have with even members of my own family who have been sucked into this goofy Black Lives Matter cult, right? It's just how it is. But we'll leave that aside for now, and we'll just use the terminology that the racists at the New York Times use. Now, everything was going really well with this propaganda for a while. The magazines were flying off the shelves. They did a podcast. They got a school curriculum to promote this to little children who unfortunately wouldn't know any better. In fact, it was going so well for them that Hannah-Jones joined Walter Duranty as another New York Times communist propagandist who got a Pulitzer Prize, right? Walter Duranty got his Pulitzer Prize for lying to Americans by parroting Stalin's propaganda and covering up the genocide of Ukrainian people. The Times has since acknowledged that that was fake news, okay? And Hannah-Jones got the Pulitzer Prize for lying to Americans about their history and regurgitating obvious false communist propaganda in America. Isn't it interesting how history repeats itself? Okay. Then actual historians started looking at this and they're like, wait a minute, this is absurd. Okay. As soon as historians started looking at it, the whole thing crumbled. You actually had this coalition of prominent historians from Princeton and other great universities, some of the world's top specialists on American history, the history of the Revolution, the history of Civil War. They sent a letter to the New York Times and they demanded, and I quote, prominent corrections of all the errors and distortions contained in this project. They said, and I quote, these errors, which concern major events, cannot be described as interpretation or framing. Okay? They said that they are matters of verifiable facts, which are the foundation of both honest scholarship and honest journalism. Now, this group of historians was brought together by Princeton historian Sean Villentz, who, by the way, is an anti-Trump activist. He is not a conservative in any way, shape, or form. The other historians he brought together, mostly liberals, James McPherson, Gordon Wood, James Oakes, Lincoln Richard Carwardine, and others. Okay, just to give you a sense of who we're dealing with here, these are the most widely recognized scholars in this field saying that this is false. They said the enormity of these errors suggests that displacement of historical understanding by ideology has taken place here. Okay, interesting. They even said the most important points of the narrative are false, that there's no historical evidence to support them. Even the central plank of this narrative, the idea that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery, is obviously false. They said they couldn't find a single example of a single colonist who supported the revolution so they could preserve slavery. This is what Gordon Wood, a historian, said. He said, I don't know of any colonists who said they wanted independence to preserve their slaves, okay? Not a single one. They said this is so wrong in so many ways. Another historian, McPherson, he's been described by the Wall Street Journal as the dean of Civil War historians. He blasted the Times for unbalanced, one-sided account. He said they left most of the history out. Okay, and that's just the mild conservative or the mild criticism from liberal historians. Once you get into what the conservatives have said, it's racist, pseudo-historical propaganda. One person even called it neo-Confederate trash. That gives you a sense of how scholars have looked at this. Interestingly, even the radical left has been debunking this. The World Socialist website, which is a Trotskyite group, they interviewed a whole bunch of historians, and they all said this is trash. They pointed out that some of the greatest Black Americans were completely ignored in this narrative. They don't even mention anything from Frederick Douglass for the 1619 Project. They interviewed an Oxford historian of America, Richard Carwardine, And he described this as a one-sided narrative. He says, I'm troubled that this is designed to make its way into classrooms as the true story of the United States because I say it's so partial. He blasted the central narrative as preposterous. He says it's wrong in fundamentals. Okay, that's how serious this is, guys. That's how wrong this is. He also noted that the majority of the movement for abolition was made up of people with light skin, descendants of Europeans. He pointed out that it was evangelical Protestant fervor that was behind the abolition movement, right? And he says, and I quote, this urgent thrust towards immediate emancipation surely poses a problem for those who see racial hostility as the ineradicable DNA of white America. Okay, and again, these are liberals, people. These are people who agree with the general worldview of the left-wing propagandists at the New York Times. He pointed out that white American Christians were martyred and were willing to be martyred for what they acknowledged as the biblical reality that people with darker skin were created in God's image, just like people with lighter skin, that they're all endowed by God with inalienable rights, that they are all created equal. And so they were willing to put their lives on the line to make this a reality. The 1619 Project completely erases all of this and turns history upside down. And, you know, on and on and on it goes. There are so many historians now who have spoken out about this. It's just incredible how discredited this is. Will Entz, the Princeton historian, pointed out that the idea that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery is ludicrous. He said there was actually more anti-slavery activity in the colonies than in Britain. One really interesting historian, he wrote in the City Journal, his name is Alan Guelzo. He pointed out that this was really a giant conspiracy theory, the 1619 Project, and he pointed out that it was concocted from the chair of ultimate cultural privilege in America, that being the New York Times. He says, in no human society has an enslaved people suddenly found itself vaulted into positions of such privilege, and with the consent, even the approbation of those who were once the enslavers. Okay, and yet here Hannah-Jones, from her position of ultra privilege, is talking down to America. Unbelievable. Now, the Times even hired its own fact checker. Her name is Leslie Harris, and she tried to tell them that this was wrong, that they couldn't actually go to press with this. They ignored her, and they did it anyway. So she blew the whistle. She went to Politico and wrote a piece about how they ignored her. She says, far from being fought to preserve slavery, the Revolutionary War became a primary disruptor of slavery. Oh, you don't want to mention that, right? Unbelievable how dishonest the New York Times is. She says, despite my advice, the Times published the incorrect statement about the American Revolution anyway in Hannah-Jones's introductory essay. The paper also mischaracterized what slavery was like in early America, incidentally. Now, you don't need to rely on modern-day historians to recognize that the New York Times is making stuff up. They're lying, right? And we know who the father of lie is. Now, the Heritage Foundation, Dr. John York, compiled a really incredible list of quotes from the Founding Fathers, all verified, all from letters and official documents that anybody can access. Here's one from George Washington. There is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery. That was in a letter published in 1786, before the Constitution was written and ratified, posted online, right on the government's archives. Obviously, George Washington was not pro-slavery. He also freed all his slaves and made provision in his will that any slaves who couldn't take care of themselves because they were old or whatever would be taken care of from his estate. Okay, let that sink in and wonder, why is the New York Times so dishonest? Thomas Jefferson, who wrote our Declaration of Independence, same deal. John Adams, first vice president, second president. Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, who wrote our Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, George Mason, John Jay. The Founding Fathers almost universally rejected slavery. In fact, the original draft of the Declaration of Independence talked about how evil it was. Now, the Founding Fathers wanted to get rid of it, and eventually they did, right? Right away, they started working on how to stop it. Now, obviously, the New York Times is lying. It's beyond clear. And so some Black Americans are now resisting. They're fighting back. An incredible new initiative called the 1776 Unites Initiative aims to provide an inspirational alternative to fight back against this anti-American slander being marketed by the New York Slimes. It's led by a guy called Bob Woodson, a civil rights leader, and it is a devastating blow to the phony narrative. They're hoping that this will be used as an alternate curriculum in schools so that the 1619 Project's lies will not be internalized by naive young Americans. So check out these comments from from Bob Woodson.
1619 postures is that all of the problems facing inner city blacks are attributed to factors that are external to that community. Explain to me how institutional racism could cause black people to fail in systems run by their own people. Tell me how that works. Nothing is more lethal to a people than to convey to them that it's impossible for them to be agents of their own uplift. Black America has exhibited, many of them, a level of resilience in the Bronzeville section of Chicago. At a time of redlining in 1929, there were 731 Black-owned businesses. Blacks controlled $100 million in real estate assets. When Blacks were denied access to hotels, we built our own. The Wallahaji in Atlanta, the St. Charles in Chicago. Kids in the inner city are inspired to improve their lives when you give them victories that are possible. There are two groups of people that I am sick and tired of. That is self-flagellating, guilty white people and angry, rich Blacks.
All right, there you go, folks, right? So now this is legitimate scholarship. This is legitimate history. Now, obviously, there's a lot of concern about this in Washington. Concerns are growing. Senator Tom Cotton has introduced a bill in the Senate to defund any public schools that are using this propaganda. Obviously, we shouldn't have federal funding of schools to begin with, but as long as we have it, it's a good conversation to have. President Donald Trump, same thing. He's threatened to defund these public schools that are using this garbage in their schools. He's actually signed an executive order now to create a commission to explore U.S. history so that Americans can learn real history instead of the fraudulent version being marketed by the New York Times. But obviously, you know, the indoctrination of children is a crucial weapon of the deep state in this war on America. We've talked about it many, many times here. Donald Trump actually mentioned recently in his speech at Mount Rushmore. I want to show you this little clip here.
The violent mayhem we have seen in the streets and cities that are run by liberal Democrats in every case is the predictable result of years of extreme indoctrination and bias in education, journalism, and other cultural institutions. Against every law of society and nature, our children are taught in school to hate their own country and to believe that the men and women who built it were not heroes, but that were villains.
So there you go. The president hit the nail on the head. Rush Limbaugh's been saying the same thing, right? These left-wing activists of posing as teachers are brainwashing our children, urge parents to get their kids out. Franklin Graham, responding to these LGBT history mandates in New Jersey, also said parents get your children out. Incredibly important. You know, it's just unbelievable how bad this has gotten. And parents, you know, if you don't protect your children, nobody is going to do it for you. Obviously, 1619 Project is not the first time. We had Zinn's phony history, Howard Zinn and his People's History of the United States. Again, just more blatantly fake history, just made it up completely. Mary Grabar, PhD, has debunked that recently in her new book. Unbelievable how just incredibly fake this history is, but it's all strategic, right? It's all strategic. Now, it's not to say that people of African heritage have never been demonized and dehumanized by people of European heritage. And I mean, it's something we should talk about. We should talk about it a lot, right? Charles Darwin. Let's talk about Charles Darwin. This is a raging racist. He actually believed that there were favored races. That was actually the title of his book, right? Origin of Species, the Survival of the Favored Races. He wrote in one of his books that the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. Okay, that's what he said. He claimed that the differences between gorillas and black people and people from Australia were smaller than the differences between Europeans and Africans. Now, if you believe that, you might be a racist, and yet here we are. Everybody's talking about racism. Nobody's talking about Charles Darwin, right? You think there's an ulterior agenda? How about Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, who believed minorities were human weeds whose genes should be removed from the gene pool through eugenics, right? Why don't we talk about that in the 1619 Project? Oh, no, because that doesn't fit the narrative, right? Trying to demonize America, not the abortion butchers, not the evolutionists. You just want to demonize America, right? Now, the real racism today is coming from the New York Times. Consider, for example, the fact that Miss Hannah-Jones herself is a virulent, disgusting racist. She actually published a letter in the New York Times back in 1995 where she said white people were devils, they're rapists, they're mass murderers, as a whole race, right? Just if you have light skin, you are guilty. Okay, that is completely at odds with the Christian view of individual responsibility for sin, right? You're not guilty because somebody else who maybe looks a little bit like you did something wrong. You're guilty because you have sinned yourself. So this is a very flawed worldview from the beginning. Now, what about this racist that they hired in 2018, this Sarah Jeong? She wrote on Twitter that it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men. She said white people are only fit to live underground like groveling goblins. Okay, that's racism. That is racism, okay? America is not racist, much less does it have racist DNA. Very ironically, very interestingly, the arguments that Hannah-Jones is making are actually the exact same arguments that actual pro-slavery racists made. People like John Calhoun argued that no. The Declaration of Independence, the idea that all men are created equal, that clearly does not apply to black people, right? That is what Hannah-Jones is saying. That is what John Calhoun is saying. Isn't it interesting that the New York Times is parroting the same racist, idiotic propaganda that was peddled by pro-slavery white supremacists? Surprise, surprise, right? Anyways, unbelievable. Of course, Hannah-Jones also doesn't mention several indisputable facts that completely destroy her fake narrative. Consider, for example, the fact that immigrants from Nigeria to the United States tend to do, on average, significantly better than descendants of Europeans who were born in the United States. If America is systematically racist and oppressive, why are black people from Nigeria doing better than white people born in America? No answer to that, right? So we just don't mention it in our 1619 project. And if America's so white supremacist, how could it be, right? If it's in our DNA as a nation, how could it be? Nor does Miss Hannah-Jones mention the fact that there are now more black people who immigrated voluntarily from Africa to the United States than those who were brought here as slaves, okay, after being purchased from other Africans, from African warlords and African chiefs. None of that is mentioned because, of course, it discredits her lies. Unbelievable how dishonest these people are. And again, this is not a new thing for the New York Times. Never let them obscure the memory of Walter Duranty. Never let them forget about Herbert Matthews, right? The liars who were responsible for the genocide of Ukrainians, the liars who were responsible for the enslavement and mass murder of Cubans. Let's not let them forget it, right? The Times is a mouthpiece for the deep state. This 1619 project is a tool of the deep state to demonize America. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the reality is exactly the opposite of what Hannah-Jones and the New York Times are claiming, right? If you understand real American history, you realize that it is the biblical principles that America was founded on that facilitated the ending of slavery all over the world. First in the Christian West, first in Britain, first in America, first in Canada, first in Europe, and eventually all over the rest of the world, right? And again, it took a long time. You could still buy and sell slaves without any criminal sanctions in Mauritania in 2007. It took a long time, but the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, these ideas that came from the Bible, that were enshrined in America, have now spread all over the world. And today, it's at the very least socially unacceptable to advocate for slavery. You can thank America's founding fathers for that. As George Orwell put it, folks, those who control the present can control the past, and those who control the past will control the future. That is why the liars and the dishonest propagandists at the New York Times behind the 1619 Project are trying to reframe the past, right? You can't destroy America if it's this beacon of hope and liberty and light for all the world. Instead, you have got to demonize it, and the only way you can demonize it is by using lies, right? If you tell the truth, the American people would love America. They would love their heritage. They would realize that they are some of the most blessed people to have ever walked on this planet. And I say this as somebody who grew up outside of the United States. I grew up in Latin America, then in Europe, then in Africa. Americans don't know how good they have it here because they've been deceived by liars, by people like Hannah-Jones, by dishonest con artists, and by Marxists. As Trump explained, the propaganda that the New York Times is peddling, the propaganda in the 1619 Project, is very similar to the propaganda that was coming out of the Soviet Union about America. There's a reason for that, okay? They all have their roots in the same place. And if you have discernment, you know just what I'm talking about. Folks, their goal is to destroy our nation. Their goal is to destroy our liberty. And they know that the best way to do that is to brainwash our young people into believing that America is evil. So it's bad enough that paying adults, gullible people, are buying this propaganda and reading it. But when they try to push it on our children using our tax money, we need to say, no, 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 now you've crossed the line. That's not just wrong, it should be criminal. It's time for this abomination called the 1619 Project, this deep state lie, to be removed from our schools and to be fully investigated. We need to find out what is going on in these indoctrination centers posing as public schools. This is poison being fed into the minds of our children, and it's just as deadly, if not more dangerous, than actual poison being swallowed. Our nation's future and our children depend on us getting this right, folks. Don't let the deep state deceive you.
If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe, hit like, hit that little bell so that you'll be notified whenever we post new videos. And also, please make sure to share this video with your friends. Email's a great way to do it. Remember, there are powerful forces working to steal our freedom and destroy our country. We need to work together, expose those behind the deep state. Otherwise, you can kiss your liberties goodbye.